All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you, whoever you are, whether you are a new listener or a returning friend. Thank you for putting some attention here. I don't know when you're listening to this. If it's the morning of its publication, well, then it's the day before the 2024 U.S. presidential election. And you wouldn't know that from listening to this show because it's not something that I've been talking about, which I consider a point of personal pride and practice, frankly. Because if you go far enough back into the archives, you'll hear me waxing poetic about whatever's going on in the world, and often I would say in a somewhat reckless manner. Because I just wasn't thinking through what I wanted to say to people before I said it. And that's sort of the format of these intros and outros for this show. I don't script any of this. I spend a little time contemplating where I'm at and checking in. And sometimes I've got a little bit of an idea of this or that I might want to talk about, but I definitely don't write it out. And then I hit record and we just talk. I try to talk into this mic the way that I would talk to my best friend. And what happens, happens. And I think in the past, sometimes, and I've discussed this before, I was just like too late at night and I'm too tired. And so what would come out was just like raw and just not clear. And I think therefore would often cause ripple effects in listeners. People would get mad at me for things that I said. I think things that I was saying were confusing and contradictory of themselves. It wasn't like cogent thoughts. And it's not that I still don't fall into that from time to time. It's just now the ritual of talking into this mic is clearer for me. I'm more aware of the fact that to the people who listen to this show, that's going to have some kind of effect on them in terms of the experience listening to the show, and whether that's an enjoyable experience, whether that's a thought-provoking experience in a way that makes you feel like inspired and curious, or whether it kind of riles you up and gets you mad and angry about stuff. And not that there's not room for both of those things, but I think I have just become more conscious about not wanting to, recklessly say things that ultimately undermine my deeper purpose in doing this. Ultimately, I'm looking to encourage a certain humanity and a certain equanimity and love in myself and in the world. And if I'm going off on whatever political thing is happening, then I think very often I wasn't doing that. I wasn't fostering a space where people were asking questions in the way that I think yoga is encouraging. In many regards, I was just further fueling the fire of division and what I think is actually some kind of agenda that works against people. So, I have avoided saying anything about this election on the show. And it's not like it hasn't been very prevalent in my life. I live in Pennsylvania, which is one of the very few toss-up states that is considered where the election's going to be decided. And I have had so many canvassers come to my door this year. I've lived here since 2017, so I've had a couple of elections, but never have I had so many people knock on my door to want to talk to me about the election and ask me who I'm voting for, which they never have done that in the past, but they were doing it this year. Maybe I'll say something more about that on the other side of today's talk, but just to note that it's been prevalent in my life And I imagine a lot of you, I was looking at the statistics before I hit record, about half of you live in the United States. The other half live scattered throughout the world, mostly the UK, Australia, and Canada. But even if you don't live in the United States, I imagine you're aware of what's going on here in the United States in our crazy election. Although I am curious what the news looks like. Sometimes I do try to tune into news from other countries, and you get really different news than if you're only watching the news here. In any case, one of the things that I have certainly been thinking about and talking about with my fellow yoga teachers over the last month or so, I would say especially, is what, if any, role should a yoga teacher play when it comes to being engaged or active in different causes or political campaigns? And in the past, back in like 2016 and 2017, I think there was a general consensus that yoga teachers had come to be influencers of sorts, that yoga teachers had developed platforms where they had like lots of followers on social media or a lot of people paying attention to what they were saying. And because yoga teachers were in a position of privilege to have those kind of platforms, they really needed to use those platforms for good. They needed to stand for things and speak out on things. And I certainly felt that way and did so. But I have come to really question that because, as I was saying, a lot of times when people go on social media and make a post, I don't really know that it's having the impact that we would intend for it to have. I think in a way it's sometimes a lot of virtue signaling, and sometimes it doesn't feel in the spirit of what yoga is teaching, if you ask me. Now, I imagine there's others out there who would think otherwise. But I have to say, over the last 2 weeks, I saw at least a half dozen posts from yoga teachers drawing upon Patanjali's Yoga Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita to explain why we all needed to vote for Harris. And, whatever you think about the election and whoever you're going to vote for me, just from like a epistemological humility, like just from a place of let's be honest about stuff, it was incredibly selective. The arguments that were being made for why yoga teaches you to vote for this one candidate, and it was Harris. I shouldn't even say this one candidate because there was no yoga teachers I saw who were saying that the Yoga Sutras are teaching us that we should vote for Trump. And, to me, there's too much hypocrisy for it to hold water. Like, both sides vote for wars. So how are you going to parse which yamas and niyamas we're going to stand by and which ones we're not? Or it just, to me, a lot of it doesn't hold water. And it just makes me feel that by putting out certain strong opinions in the public eye. Now, granted, if it's private, if it's a personal private matter, and I'm having a conversation with somebody at the yoga center, and they ask me, like, what do you think about this? I'm happy to have this conversation. And I actually have had some really amazing in-person conversations with people about some of the stuff that's been going on. But that is completely different than me coming on here and explaining to you what the right thing to do is and who we should be voting for. Or making some kind of Instagram post out of like this feeling of like, I gotta use my platform to speak out on this important election. To me, there's some big issues in there. And I just don't know that, one, it really does what people think or hope it's going to do. And two, if it isn't just playing into the very divisions and like the patterns of behavior and thought that I think are serving people in positions of power more than the people who are being exploited. And I don't think yoga teachers want to do that. I think yoga teachers are all very well intentioned. They all want to be lights shining into the world. I just question whether standing up and using your platform to proselytize. We don't do it in yoga. We've moved away from doing it in yoga and like being dogmatic and acting like gurus, at least in most areas, although I'm sure it still happens, but most yoga teachers have moved away from that. So why are we going to proselytize or act like we're in a position of authority or knowing when it comes to like politics? In any case, I've been having these conversations about whether or not yoga teachers should stay stuff and when they should stay stuff. And this coincided with getting an email from my guest today, Norman Blair. And Norman's been on the show a few other times. We talk about that. And Norman is somebody who's very vocal about stuff going on in the world and uses his platform to speak out on things that he thinks are important. And recently, I think he got a little blowback about some stuff that he wrote about Israel and Palestine. And I was like, wow, Norman is not holding back. And I appreciate that about him. And so he and I got back together to have a conversation about whether or not it's appropriate for yoga teachers to be speaking out about what's going on in the world. And if so, in what ways and in what contexts. And it's always very refreshing to speak with Norman because he speaks in a honest and candid way. And I was really grateful to come together with him and have a difficult conversation about difficult stuff. And I'm very happy to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that if you're enjoying the show and you would like to connect with me in other ways outside of just listening, there's plenty of opportunities for us to do that. You might get in on some of my weekly live classes, or there's a weekly discussion group, or maybe you just want to touch base with some of the on-demand videos that are on there, or maybe you want to get into the full-length archives of the show and become a supporter with a podcast premium subscription. All of my stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think we will just leave it there because, we're going to get into some murky waters and let's just go ahead and get into it. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's do it. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Norman Blair. Are you there, Norman? Can you hear me?
Yes.
There you are.
Sorry, Jay.
No,
Gosh,
you made it.
how many times have I done this? And I still make kind of beginner mistakes. But at least I remember I was doing an online thing a couple of months ago, and it was suddenly like, oh no, I forgot to plug into power. So I'm plugged into power.
Well, there you go. Are you good to go? You need to get anything together? You got yourself ready? Good. You ready? You ready to talk? It's been a minute.
I'm good.
Oh, very nice. So good to see you and speak with you again, Norman.
Likewise.
I feel like we've been in touch some just because we have exchanged emails and stuff. Yeah. But anyways, you know the deal. I'm recording, so let's consider ourselves having begun.
Yep.
And I was just checking before I came on with you. I was like, oh, when did Norman last come on the show? The first time you came on was February 2019.
Wow.
And we talked about yoga teacher pay and the monetary policies of yoga centers and how, generally speaking, yoga teachers' pay was declining.
Yep.
And I remember why, because you had written a thing where you laid out the numbers and nobody ever did that. Like, you're like, this is how much we got paid 10 years ago. This is how much we get paid now. And you laid out all the numbers. And I really appreciated that somebody was being so transparent about that.
It's important to look at the numbers.
You got to know your numbers if you're going to make it work. And then the next time you came on was in April 2021. And we talked about yoga teacher unions and pay equity, which we can come back to, but I also just kind of want to acknowledge that was also a very fraught moment for the show. I had someone on that had caused a lot of controversy. A lot of people were like trying to cancel the show essentially. And a lot of people jumped on bandwagons and didn't reach out to me or anything, but you did. You reached out to me. You asked me a couple of really hard questions and I answered you honestly. And you said, good enough for me. And you booked and you came on the show. And I will always remember that as just like somebody who really stood on principle at a time when a lot of people didn't. So compliments to you. I've always feel indebted to you for that moment. But in that conversation, we were talking about yoga teacher unions because there had been some attempts to start them. And I remember thinking at the time, maybe it was a useless conversation because we didn't really know what was going to be happening totally with the pandemic at that point. So I don't know. I guess I'm curious to catch up with you some. It's been 3 years and it feels like a lot longer. I guess I'm curious, is it even an issue now? Like because yoga teacher unions were about pushing out back against like corporate power, right? It's like giving the workers a voice, but is there even corporate yoga anymore? That like most of the yoga centers aren't owned by corporations anymore. Most of those got closed down. Yoga Works closed down or what do you think? What do you see?
Not so much here. We've actually, the Yoga Teachers Union has reformed and restarted here, which is good news. So as well as talking about the importance of pay, it's also about ensuring that our working conditions are safe and support the people who are working in studios. And just having transparency, Jay, I think this is so, so important. And as you said, it's like, let's talk about numbers for one example, rather than like kind of thinking, oh, let's not talk about this. It's un-yogic to talk about finances as much as someone very recently said to me, he said that politics should not be mentioned in yoga classes.
We'll get to that. I was going to try to soften us into that, Norm.
Okay.
But if you're ready to go there, I mean, it's the same thing. Money, same question. Like I've done that too, been transparent about numbers, and it's a very taboo thing to do. But I agree. We should be honest about what the situation is.
I was going to say, Jay, congratulations on opening up a yoga studio.
Thank you.
The Birdhouse.
That's correct.
Nice name. Yeah.
Thank you.
I like the name. So one of the things I'd like to say, and again, I think this is important, is that I want to acknowledge my privilege. So I'm privileged. I've got health. These last few months for myself and my partner have been really quite difficult. And her mum died a few months ago, and we've had 2 people in our circle who've died, and someone seriously ill. And I think we are very good at taking things for granted. I'm sure you agree with that.
Yes.
Very good at taking things for granted and not recognizing what we have. And I remember my first yoga training was Shivananda. Did you ever do any Shivananda?
Sure. Eye rolls and Shavasana between each pose. I remember.
That's the one. You got it. And I remember they said something like the wealth of health. And I think it's so true. And I will talk when teaching about actually one of the pluses of, say, injury or illness is a reminder of how much we do take for granted. So as well as having sufficient health, I'm also a well-educated white man. And I do see for myself, and I have had direct experiences in my past of what you might describe as white privilege. I have a roof over my head. I'm financially secure. So if we want to talk about numbers, myself and my partner, we paid off our mortgage about 10 years ago. And I think, this is how we can be controlled, through debt. So to be mortgage free for the last 10 years, it's like, wow, that is good. And I'm sure that's true for people in
Sure. I mean, there's sometimes property taxes and things, but still, yes.
Property taxes are pretty minimal compared to mortgage payments.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm not in a war zone.
Yes.
And I'm doing work. So we've been both teaching pretty much the same length. I started in 2001, which, as I remember, maybe was a little bit after when you started.
Yeah. I started in like 96 or 97.
So, Jay, I hope you've got your gold watch.
That's right. A gold watch. Nope. Nobody gave me any gold watches. It's in my soul. The gold watch exists.
27, 28. That's like nearly half your life.
Yeah.
So I feel very grateful that I'm doing work that I find fulfilling, even after 23 years of saying the word breathe.
Yeah.
But how many times have we said the word breath? Breathing.
Inhale, exhale 1. Inhale, exhale 2. I've said that so many times.
I don't say inhale, exhale.
You don't lead the breaths. I lead breaths, man. I've been leading breaths for 30 years. So
being very grateful, recognizing that privilege of doing work that is creative and fulfilling. This is amazing privilege. So when this person said to me, politics should not be in yoga classes, what I'm thinking is that everything is political. What we eat, how we travel, how we relate to each other. And in some ways, I think it would be good to almost drop the word like politics, even drop the word yoga. These days, I've been talking about egalitarian yoga. Do you practice egalitarian yoga, Jay?
I don't know what you mean. You'd have to clarify what you mean by egalitarian yoga.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we dropped all these terms like Ashtanga yoga, Yin yoga, Shivananda yoga, this yoga, that yoga, dogma yoga, guru yoga, egalitarian yoga, which means that all the options are equal.
So but wait a second. Okay, wait, stop right there. Already, you went right there. Good. Let's go there. I mean, first of all, just to say, and we'll come back to this in terms of like politics being in everything that you do and your choices. I agree. Like your viewpoint and all the choices that you make are, I don't think you can escape the political backdrop that we live in or whatnot. But that's very different than like sending out a newsletter about Israel and Palestine. That's not the same thing. And I guess to your claim about, to go back to egalitarian yoga, because it's actually fresh on the topic of this show, because I had Nritya, who's the director of the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandiram, on last week. And there are sort of these questions. Or I had Nishala Joy Devi on talking about her new translation to the Bhagavad Gita. And I guess the pushback to your idea of egalitarian yoga would be, aren't you in some way appropriating or not giving due reverence to the sources of these teachings and the traditions that they come from? Not to say that we have to follow all those dogmas and it shouldn't evolve, but that to just say, oh, we should forget about the names of these people because they were abusers, even though they have shaped all of the practices or many of the practices that people teach to these days.
Did I say that?
No, you didn't, but it was implied when you say just drop all the names.
Well, all I was talking about is dropping names such as Ashtanga, Yin.
So what do you call it? What do you call the work of Paul Griley or Patabi Joyce if we don't call it Ashtanga and Yin?
We could call it mindful movement.
Yeah, but that's not what they called it. That's what we're calling it.
Things evolve.
I guess so. What is your hope by doing that, by taking away those names? You said they all get to be equal, but they're not all equal. They're not all the same and equal under the sun, are they?
I think when we talk about egalitarianism, we're also talking about acknowledging uniqueness. You know, as both of us know, everyone that comes to our class is a unique being. You know, the number of like different shapes and sizes with each scene is like countless. So there's not a contradiction between talking about egalitarian yoga, where just, let's be very practical, seeing the various options as equal and seeing that the people coming along, each person is a unique being. And I think when we can have this approach of seeing each person as a unique being, that helps us to have inclusivity. I'm sure this has happened to you, Jay. I remember some years ago being at a workshop with a well-known international teacher, and it was so clear that this teacher had the in-group and the out-group. And it was really unpleasant to be in that setting. So when I'm talking to other teachers, I say it's crucial that everyone in the class is included. And obviously, if someone's been coming to your class for like 10 years, you're going to have a different relationship to that person than someone who's just turned up, dropped in for the first time. But having a sense of everyone in the class is included in the class. And part of that is seeing, as I've said, you know, having this kind of, let's talk about egalitarian yoga, rather than like a particular brand of yoga, rather than a kind of a guru yoga.
I get it. I think that we're generally in agreement. I'm picking apart the semantics because, you know, most people, even within those traditions, though, teachers have done that. Like I've been to Iyengar classes where the teacher was very dogmatic and strict and harsh, and then other Iyengar classes where the teacher made everybody feel like they were welcome in the class. So again, I think I think you're right about the way that you see people and kind of honoring people as unique beings, shaping the choices that a teacher would make. And I've certainly over the years, just because of my own practice and my own intention, done what you're talking about, like tried to make the class that I teach something that anybody could come to. Not that everybody's going to like it, but at least you're taking a stance of this is for anybody who wants to engage with it. And to do that, you're right. I have had to kind of like part from a lot of rules that at one time were in place. So I think that's kind of what you're getting to, is that some of those traditions, when held too tightly or in a way that doesn't allow them to evolve or whatnot, inhibits a certain important evolution. I mean, I guess some people call it sort of post-lineage in a way, post-lineage yoga. I know we don't like that term. You're making a face, but that is kind of what we're talking about, isn't it?
It's interesting what you said about comparing like Iyengar teachers. And I think this is true for all teachers, that, you know, I'm sure there are some very kind of militant and strict Yin teachers, as much as some very soft and gentle Ashtanga teachers and Iyengar teachers. I've been recently reading this book by a guy called Leon Hammer, Dragon Rises. So he was trained in the Western medicine as a psychiatrist, and then he got more interested in Eastern philosophies and became an acupuncturist. And he said, in 50 years of clinical experience, what I've learned is it's less what you say and more how you say. And so let's part the label and look at the teacher and the relationship the teacher has with the people in their classes.
I think that's right. And I think in a way that could take me back to the idea of like equal pay or something for yoga teachers, because one of the issues back when we were talking about that in my mind was that because we are kind of in a marketplace, we're not in a socialist situation, generally speaking.
Not yet, Jay. Not yet.
I'm not.
We can dream. And I remember what you said about was it the 2016 election, US election?
Maybe, I don't know. What did I say?
You said something about Bernie, how you supported Bernie.
I did. I mean, if you want to talk about that election, I mean, I was going to go somewhere else, but let's talk politics. You keep wanting to go politics. You're ready. I'm trying to soften us in. Okay, but here's the deal. Let's talk it then. Okay, so earlier you said that someone said to you, you shouldn't bring politics into the yoga class. And really, if we're going to be totally transparent, we're talking about transparency. One of the reasons you and I are having this conversation is because I'm still on your email list. And sure. I'm on, back in the day, I was on a good 40, 50 email lists of just yoga teachers around the world that I thought were interesting, that I wanted to pay attention to. And I never unsubscribed, but most of them are gone now. There's maybe a dozen or so still around that I get. Yours is one of them. And I would say at some point in time, you and I were kind of out there online, some in a way, and being vocal about issues, even during the pandemic or whatever, speaking out in an early part of the pandemic. People could go back and listen to the show. I was spouting off on all kinds of stuff. And then I mentioned that all to cancellation campaigns, and I've definitely come to think better of it. But you have still sometimes in your emails let it all out, you're not that you're not careful with your words, you're not reckless, but you are asserting your political views in a way that is easily triggering or polarizing to people, especially when it's issues that are really intense issues, like trans issues or Israeli-Palestine issues, recently. So I remember you sent out an email not too long ago where you spoke about Israel and Palestine. And I was like, wow. I mean, I agreed with a lot of what you had said, but it's not stuff that I always feel comfortable to say out loud to people because it is a very contentious subject. And I remember taking note. I was like, wow, Norman still sending them out there. And then I saw another one that came back that was you kind of, you've apologized in the past where you felt like you've misstepped. I remember you doing that. But in this instance, it wasn't an apology so much as an acknowledgement that definitely some people got upset. And so you reached out to me and it seemed like the email was kind of well, what do you think? Do you think teachers should be out there speaking about things and be engaged in this way? And I responded back to you and told you that I'd become more cautious. And I talked about the election because it's one of the areas that I generally don't talk about. And you're referencing Bernie is that I felt incredibly betrayed by the system. I was a registered independent my whole life. I changed my registration to vote for Bernie in the Democratic primary in 2016. I'd been a fan of Bernie's. I was a C-SPAN junkie. I remember sending him money for his Vermont campaign even before I even knew who he was. I always liked Bernie because he was speaking politics that at that time I really thought was where I aligned with. And he was the only one saying stuff. And so I changed my registration to vote for him. And I was totally disenfranchised. They did a total backhanded thing in New York where I had got my application in time to vote in the primary. And then they changed the deadline after I had already gotten it in. There wasn't any news about it, but I wasn't able to vote in that primary. And then again in 2020, I felt like it was totally, it's a long conversation, but the reason we bring that up is, I guess the reason you bring that up is I am totally disenchanted with Bernie. I think he completely let us all down, all the people who believed in him. He's just totally played ball and voted for all the wars. And it just seemed like whatever democratic socialism he was talking before, I don't see it now. And now he just seems kind of like a shill, and it's totally disheartening for me.
So can I just say, Jay?
Yeah.
I think it can be good to talk about how we feel. And I feel this. I can feel it's heartbreaking. there's a genocide going on right now as we talk. There's a genocide happening.
You just pissed off a bunch of people, by the way. That's okay, but go ahead, continue.
There's a genocide happening. And that genocide is being allowed by the governments of this country, your country. Yet, I was looking at the figures recently, something like at least 70% of the people in this country want an immediate ceasefire. And I think it's about 60% in the US. But who is that being represented by the politicians? Actually, in this country, a kind of an equivalent to some extent of Bernie Sanders is Jeremy Corbyn. And I was so happy that in the July election, that Jeremy Corbyn stood as an independent because he'd been kicked out of the Labour Party by Keir Starmer and the right wing, and he won. And I think it's important to stand up for our principles as much as it's important to say how heartbreaking things are. And I can feel for you being disillusioned, demoralized by what's been happening in the US in the last 8 years. These are really, really difficult times, Joe. And it's like, who knows what's going to happen next? So I'm assuming this program goes out in 2 weeks.
Something like that, yeah.
So God knows what's going to be happening.
Yeah, who knows? We could be already outdated, but...
Yeah, exactly. Or there might be world peace.
Well, chances of that are pretty slim, Norman.
I think, Jay, actually, there is quite a lot that we can agree about.
Sure.
And, I look at the kind of email interactions we've had, and, we definitely have common ground. But I wanted to say, when you wrote to me, and I really appreciate having this communication, and I think it's really important to have dialogue like this. And you said, I did think that your newsletter was problematic because you were weighing in on an issue that is so divisive. And then what I wrote about, and you're right, later on in the newsletter, I did talk specifically about what's happening in Gaza, Lebanon, Israel. But I wrote, wars are madness. Wars are destructive and deeply traumatizing. Wars are such a failure of imagination and such a tragedy for humanity, creating conditions that are the least conducive to life thriving. Civilians and soldiers die, generals and politicians lie. How's that divisive?
It's not divisive to me. I'm in agreement with that statement. But what you did earlier just now in this conversation say firmly, which I appreciate you asserting, that there's a genocide happening. And I definitely think there's a strong case to be made for that. I know other people who don't see it that way. Now,
there is a genocide happening without any doubt.
Again, I'm in agreement, but as you said earlier when you were talking about yoga and people all being able to have different views and it being equal, you're saying that someone who believes that there's some justification for what's being done, and again, I'm not making that case, but I know people who are close to me, or there's people who are listening to this, when you say there's a genocide happening, they are going to say you're anti-Semitic. That's how they got Jeremy Corbyn out, right? They said he was anti-Semitic. So I guess
it's a lie.
I agree, but I guess my point is this though, and this is what I was saying in the email to you. My pushback, but my thought about it is, on a personal level, like you and I are choosing to do this publicly, which is maybe stupid, I don't know, but I think that on a personal level, one, it has been difficult because I've exchanged emails with other people during the pandemic and it didn't go good. Like you and I are still friends and we didn't agree on everything, but we respected each other and I learned from your emails and just, that was good exchange, I felt. But there are other friends of mine who that friendship was deeply bruised and it hasn't recovered. So my point being that in terms of yoga teachers, and the point I made in that email to you is, I have observed that if I am not conscious about what I'm choosing to kind of put out on this show, I can get more listeners by kind of doing clickbaity kind of stoking controversy or stoking division, have more people hate me, but talking about how it feels feels horrible. That's not what I want. So I agree that we should have principles that we stand by. And I think it's okay for us to speak about these things. But as you said earlier, how we speak about them is important. And acknowledging that there's other people who are going to be find you calling it genocide highly inflammatory. You could have chosen different words, but you didn't. You wanted to assert it in a certain way.
What word would you have suggested I could have chosen, Jay?
I don't know. It could try to be more diplomatic in the sense of you could say there's a conflict happening and many people are dying and some people believe that it's a genocide and others believe it's justified. That would be kind of a neutral, like laying out both territories, but you're taking a side, which I can appreciate on one level, but from a yoga teacher's standpoint, I wonder, is that the role of a yoga teacher to be making those kinds of fostering those potential kinds of divisions, I guess is what I'm saying.
It's as human beings, Jay, we need to have these discussions. We need to have dialogue. We need to talk. And we also need to see clearly. And if we're going to be serious about ahimsa, what's currently happening is definitely harming.
Yeah, but what's happening in these larger geopolitical spheres, people in our individual lives outside of, I guess, voting, we don't really have any say in it. Like what the governments of our countries are choosing to do and fight these wars. So for us to be like acting like making a social media post or me doing a podcast episode about the genocide is going to actually in any way change. I guess what the idea is, someone might listen to it and then they might vote differently.
So I think this has been one of the great triumphs of what you could call neoliberalism, and other people are calling late stage capitalism, which is disempowerment, which is what happened from the late 20th century is the increasing power of capital and the declining power of labor, which means that people say, as you just said, it's like, I can't do anything. On a very small example, Jay, back in the 1980s, 1990s, I was involved in sabotaging hunts in the UK, so fox hunts, a very barbaric practice. And that's now illegal. Friends of mine were involved in campaigns against fur coats. Fur coats are pretty marginal these days. When I went vegetarian in 1982, that was very weird, very weird. And now I can't remember what the statistics are, but it's like maybe 1 in 10 are vegetarians, something like that, and it's significantly higher amongst young people. The important truth is that things change, and the question we need to have is like, how do we want things to change, and what are we prepared to do to help things change? And I believe that in some ways, we're skating on thin ice. So back in
What
the
do you
States,
mean by that? What do you mean by skating on thin ice?
Well, you just had 2 hurricanes.
True.
I would really recommend, so listeners, listen up. Read this novel, great novel by an American, The Deluge, Stephen Markley. I would highly recommend. It came out maybe 6 months ago. So Jay will put it in the show notes afterwards.
I will.
It's a great, great novel. And things are shifting. And the question is, which way do we want them to shift? And then I'm thinking of like, you've got 2 kids, 1 kid.
2.
Our responsibility. So I've got a nephew and a niece who I dearly love. And, I want them to grow up in a world that they can thrive in, rather than a world that they're like struggling to survive. And what's happening with like climates. I just said about those two hurricanes, Helena and Milton. What's
I
happening?
know, but here's the thing, like, I try to buy organic vegetables. I recycle. We have recycling programs. I've been doing that for years. But, as I've looked into this, I remember Roger Moore did a video about climate change and recycling and showing how like the green economy was actually not helping the environment or whatever. We're like tearing down rainforests to build solar farms or whatever.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I just feel like there's a, to me at some point, I don't even, again, I'm looking at what can I do in my life that actually is, I hear you about late stage capitalism, but it's real. It's not just like an imagination in my mind. I could try to go out and get involved in my local politics. And I've actually looked at that. I'm involved in my neighborhood association. I know my mayor. I've talked with him. I know people on the city council. So I see what's going on with my local government. I don't feel very confident that me getting into local government is going to do anything. And I guess I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate. I think maybe the more important question I have for you is, when you go to teach a yoga class, like, are you teaching classes these days?
Currently I'm teaching one class a week, and then I'm doing maybe 3 or 4 workshops a month, and then I'm teaching courses.
Okay, so when you show up to one of these workshops or this class once a week, are you bringing up the genocide in Gaza before class?
So it's funny you say that, Jay, because after the election in 2019, so what we have in this country, I'm going to use a term that actually came from a conservative politician, Lord Hailsham. So this is probably about mid-20th century, and he described the system that we have in this country as an elective dictatorship. So when the Labour Party, under its right-wing leader, Keir Starmer, won the election in July, they got something like 30% of the vote, and they won something like 60% of the seats. So they've got this huge majority, but actually the number of people who supported them is less than the number of people who voted for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party in 2017 and 2019. So in 2019, it was the other way around, where we had this Boris Johnson figure and his party, the Conservative Party, they won the election with a large majority, but not a majority of the votes. And that was on a Thursday. And I was devastated by this result. Jeremy Corbyn is a very honorable man who is absolutely not anti-Semitic. Just to kind of go back, just to touch on anti-Semitism, many Jewish people are strongly, vigorously opposed to what's going on in the Middle East. And they're putting their bodies on the line to make that clear. I think being critical of Zionism is being pro-Semitic. So I think we have to make a division between Zionism and Judaism. I think this is really important. But going back to the 2019 election, so this result happens, I'm devastated. We've got Brexit in this country, which is like all the little Englanders waving their flags. Not that I'm in favor of the EU as this kind of vast capitalist institution. And at the beginning of so I was teaching a workshop on Sunday, and at the beginning of the workshop, I said, I'm really upset. So this is after 18 years of teaching, Jay, lots of water under the bridge, and still I made this mistake. I make mistakes. And I said at the beginning of the workshop, I'm really upset. And someone stood up and said, Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitic. And I was like, no, he's not. Yes, he is. No, he's not.
Oh, you were done. You were done right at that moment.
Such a mistake. Yeah. And I was flustered. This is not a good environment to start a yoga class. So it was a good learning for me. And I think, I really want to encourage what you might describe as critical thinking within yoga teaching. And, to be honest, If anyone says to me, all is good, I want to vomit. If anyone says to me, the universe will manifest, I'm just like rolling my eyes. So critical thinking means like evaluating what we're doing as teachers and as practitioners. So going back to that particular incident, that was a mistake. I learned from that, and going back, and I appreciate what you said to me, Jay. I am aware. I can do like 2-footed tackles. I'm an angry young man, even though I'm like 61 years old, and I can now travel for free on London transport. Is like one of the big pluses of living in London over 60. I know you don't have any public transport in the US, Jay.
Not like that, but yeah.
So I think just bringing in ideas around ahimsa, non-harming, talking about truthfulness, and something I've been talking about a lot is that everything connects. So we walk around, and if we walk around, like if I walk around like with a scowl, looking grumpy, someone else sees me and they can feel that a little bit. If I walk around feeling like open-hearted and warm, people can see that. If I'm going to the tube station and someone's there with a heavy bag or a pram and I offer to help them, that sense of connection, everything connects. And sometimes I'll talk about if we want to simplify all our practices, so all these decades of experience that you and I have, Jay, and many, many other people have, we want to simplify it. It's like everything connects, everything changes. That's it.
I think that's true. I guess where there is a gray area is that I do think yoga has often been able to be a bit of a neutral space.
Nothing is neutral, Jay. Let me tell you a story.
Well, wait a second, though. Within yoga, there's atheism to theism. And I think that there's nothing in the sutras, like you saying, okay, you're using ahimsa, right? So there's nothing in the sutras that is teaching you directly about geopolitics. It's something about an individual's experience. So each person's individual experience and awareness and sense of self. And yes, I agree, those things would end up being expressed in what they eat and who they vote for.
I was talking recently to a Palestinian yoga practitioner, and they said to me, so I'm not an expert on these kind of yogic texts, I've read them, but I'm not an expert on them. And this person said to me that something like the Bhagavad Gita is like, this is jihadism. So I can't make a comment on that because I don't know really the Bhagavad Gita. But, if we're looking at the yamas and the niyamas, this isn't just about inside, it's also outside.
Right. But I've also heard yamas and niyamas described or taught as not like things that you're supposed to follow, but the natural result of practice. That if you're going, we talked about how you feel. If I'm going to make decisions based on how I feel, stealing and lying feels really shitty, but being honest and kind feels really good.
Sometimes we might have to do that.
Do what?
Okay. I want to go back to when you said about neutral.
Okay.
So
you didn't like neutral, huh?
Someone who you and I, we both know this person. And they were talking to me and they said, so I'm paraphrasing, but they said like, I'm neutral. And I'm like, no one is neutral. We all have our pasts. We all have different views. We all have different experiences. No one is neutral. But if we're going to talk about kind of yamas and niyamas, and I see them as guides, and this is a trivial example, but a friend of mine, but it was a good teaching to me. A friend of mine, this is a long time ago, she went and she had a radical haircut. And she came back and she said, what do you think of my haircut? And I was very much into, I saw the smile, Jay. I think you can know what's going to happen. I was very much into satya, truthfulness. And I said, well, not that much. And this did not go down well. My truthfulness needed to be tempered by ahimsa, by kindness. It was a good lesson for me, Jay. And clearly, sometimes, major things we need to be.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.